The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Baptist Church in Cedar Falls, Iowa, casting colorful patterns across the worn wooden pews. It was October 12, 1986, and the autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. 8-year-old Timmy Morrison sat between his parents, Margaret and Robert, his small hands folded in his lap, as Pastor Williams delivered the Sunday sermon about faith and perseverance. If you're following this story and want to hear more mysteries like this one, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Timmy was a bright boy with sandy brown hair and curious green eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He wore his favorite blue sweater that his grandmother had knitted for him the previous Christmas, complete with a small cross embroidered on the chest. The Morrison family had been attending St. Matthew's for over a decade, ever since they moved to Cedar Falls from Chicago. Robert worked at the John Deere plant, while Margaret taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. They were the kind of family that neighbors waved to and community members respected, steady, reliable, and deeply rooted in their faith. After the service ended at 11:30 a.m., the congregation filed out into the crisp autumn morning. The church parking lot buzzed with the usual post-service conversations. Children ran between the cars, while parents discussed upcoming Harvest Festival preparations and shared updates about their lives. Timmy had asked his mother if he could play with his friend Jason Walsh, whose family lived just 3 blocks from the church. Margaret had agreed, reminding Timmy to be home by 1 p.m. for Sunday dinner. "Remember what I told you about staying where adults can see you," Margaret called after him as he ran toward Jason's parents' car. "And don't go anywhere else without asking first." Timmy waved back at his mother, his gap-toothed smile beaming in the sunlight. It was the last time Margaret and Robert Morrison would see their son for 38 years. The Walsh family lived on Maple Street in a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a large oak tree in the front yard. Jason's mother, Linda Walsh, had prepared a light lunch for the boys, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with apple slices and chocolate milk. The 2 friends sat at the kitchen table, chattering about the upcoming Halloween and whether they should be pirates or astronauts for trick-or-treating. Around 12:15 p.m., Jason suggested they go outside to play in the backyard. Linda Walsh was washing dishes when she heard the boys laughing and running around the garden. She glanced out the window periodically, watching them climb the old apple tree and chase each other around the swing set that Jason's father had built the previous summer. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant sound of lawn mowers and the occasional car passing by. At approximately 12:45 p.m., Jason came running into the house, his face flushed from playing. "Mom, can we have some water? We're really thirsty," he panted, heading straight for the refrigerator. Linda poured 2 glasses of cold water and handed them to her son. "Where's Timmy?" she asked, noticing that only Jason had come inside. "He said he saw something by the fence and went to look," Jason replied between gulps of water. "He'll be right back." Linda Walsh stepped out onto the back porch and called Timmy's name. The backyard was empty, except for the swing moving gently in the breeze. She walked around the house, checking the front yard and calling his name louder. A knot of worry began forming in her stomach as she realized the boy was nowhere to be seen. "Jason, when exactly did you last see Timmy?" she asked her son, trying to keep her voice calm. Jason thought for a moment, his 8-year-old mind trying to piece together the timeline. "We were playing hide-and-seek, and he said he found a really good hiding spot by the back fence. That was, maybe when you gave us the water." Linda's heart began to race. She had given the boys water only 10 minutes ago, which meant Timmy had been missing for at least that long. She quickly called the Morrison household, hoping that perhaps Timmy had decided to walk home early. The phone rang several times before Robert answered. "Robert, this is Linda Walsh. Is Timmy there with you?" "No, he should still be at your house." Why? Robert's voice immediately took on a concerned tone. I can't find him. He was playing in the backyard with Jason, and now he's just gone. Within minutes, both families were searching the neighborhood. Robert and Margaret Morrison arrived at the Walsh house with faces pale with worry. The four adults split up to cover more ground, while Jason stayed with a neighbor who had offered to help coordinate the search. They knocked on doors, checked garages, looked behind sheds, and called Timmy's name until their voices grew hoarse. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, an elderly widow who lived at the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, told them she had seen a young boy matching Timmy's description walking alone toward the park around 12:50 p.m. He seemed to be following someone, she said, adjusting her thick glasses. I couldn't see who it was from my window, but the boy wasn't running or acting scared. He was just walking purposefully like he knew where he was going. Cedar Falls Park was only 4 blocks from the Walsh house, and it was a place where many local children played. The park featured a playground, several picnic tables, a small pond, and wooded walking trails that connected to the larger Winnebago County Forest Preserve. As daylight began to fade, more neighbors joined the search. Someone had called the Cedar Falls Police Department, and by 4 p.m., 2 patrol cars had arrived to help coordinate the effort. Officer Dennis McKenna, a 20-year veteran of the force, took detailed statements from both families. He was a tall, sturdy man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too many difficult situations over the years. McKenna had handled missing child cases before, and he knew that the first few hours were crucial. I need you to think carefully about anyone who might have approached Timmy recently, he told the Morrisons as they sat in the Walsh family's living room. Anyone who showed unusual interest in him, asked questions about his routine, or made him feel uncomfortable. Margaret Morrison racked her brain, trying to remember any suspicious interactions. There was a man at the grocery store last week, she said slowly. He was asking Timmy about school, where he went, what grade he was in. I thought it was just friendly conversation, but now... Can you describe him? McKenna asked, pulling out his notepad. Middle-aged, maybe 40 or 50. Average height, brown hair. He was wearing a denim jacket and jeans, nothing that really stood out, which is why I didn't think much of it at the time. Officer McKenna made detailed notes and radioed for additional units to expand the search area. As darkness fell, volunteers with flashlights combed through the park and the surrounding wooded areas. The Cedar Falls Fire Department brought in search dogs, and the K9 units were able to pick up Timmy's scent leading from the Walsh backyard toward the park. But the trail went cold near the pond. The search continued through the night and into the following week. The FBI was called in on the 3rd day, as the case now met the criteria for possible child abduction. Special Agent Patricia Reeves, a specialist in missing children cases, arrived from the Des Moines field office. She was a methodical investigator with short auburn hair and an intensity that both reassured and worried the Morrison family. Agent Reeves expanded the investigation beyond Cedar Falls, checking with law enforcement agencies across Iowa and neighboring states. She coordinated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to create and distribute flyers with Timmy's photograph. The image showed a smiling boy with bright green eyes and a mischievous grin, wearing the blue sweater he had on the day he disappeared. The investigation revealed several troubling details. A convenience store clerk in nearby Waterloo reported seeing a man fitting the description Margaret had given purchasing candy and children's snacks on the day of Timmy's disappearance. A gas station attendant in Charles City, about 40 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, remembered a man with a young boy who seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn. The man had paid cash for gas and declined when the attendant offered the boy a free piece of gum, saying the child was not feeling well. Despite hundreds of interviews, dozens of search operations, and countless tips from the public, Timmy Morrison seemed to have vanished without a trace. The FBI maintained the case as active for several years, but as time passed and new cases demanded attention, the investigation gradually shifted to a cold case status. The Morrison family never gave up hope, but the lack of answers took a devastating toll on their marriage and their faith. Margaret Morrison blamed herself for letting Timmy go to play that day. She replayed the morning over and over in her mind, wondering what she could have done differently. Robert threw himself into work, spending long hours at the plant, to avoid the empty house that still contained all of Timmy's belongings, exactly as he had left them. The couple attended therapy and grief counseling, but the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their son created a wound that never properly healed. The community of Cedar Falls rallied around the Morrison family in the weeks and months following Timmy's disappearance. Fundraisers were organized to help with search costs and to support the family during Robert's time away from work. St. Matthew's Baptist Church held special prayer services, and Pastor Williams often visited the Morrison home to provide spiritual comfort. However, as years passed and life moved forward for others, the acute attention gradually faded, leaving the family to cope with their loss in relative isolation. In 1992, 6 years after Timmy's disappearance, Margaret and Robert Morrison made the difficult decision to divorce. The strain of their shared trauma had become too much for their relationship to bear. Margaret moved to Minneapolis to live with her sister, while Robert remained in Cedar Falls, unable to leave the place where he had last seen his son. He kept the house on Elm Street, maintaining Timmy's room exactly as it had been, hoping against hope that someday his boy would come home. The case generated periodic media attention over the years, particularly around the anniversaries of Timmy's disappearance. Local newspapers would run remembrance articles, and occasionally a television program would feature the case as part of a missing children segment. Each time, tips would come in from people who thought they had seen Timmy or had information about the case, but none of the leads ever panned out. In 1996, 10 years after the disappearance, the Cedar Falls Police Department received a call from a woman in Oregon who claimed to have seen a teenager who looked remarkably like the age-progressed photos of Timmy that had been circulated. The young man was living with a family and appeared to be well cared for, but something about his mannerisms and the way he reacted to certain questions made the caller suspicious. Agent Reeves, who was still with the FBI but now based in Portland, personally investigated the lead. DNA testing conclusively proved that the teenager was not Timmy Morrison. Similar false alarms occurred sporadically over the years. A construction worker in Phoenix thought he recognized Timmy in a young man working at a fast food restaurant. A teacher in Denver contacted authorities about a student who had some physical similarities and seemed uncomfortable discussing his early childhood. Each lead was thoroughly investigated, and each one ultimately led to disappointment for the Morrison family. Robert Morrison never remarried. He continued working at the John Deere plant until his retirement in 2010, and he became something of a local expert on missing children cases. He volunteered with various organizations dedicated to helping families of missing persons, and he often spoke at community events about child safety. His hair turned completely gray, and the lines around his eyes deepened with each passing year. But he never lost the hope that someday he would learn what had happened to his son. Margaret Morrison eventually remarried in 1998 to a kind man named David Peterson, whom she met through a support group for parents of missing children. David had lost his own daughter in a car accident, and he understood the complex grief that comes with losing a child. Margaret was able to find some peace in her new life, but she never forgot Timmy or stopped wondering about his fate. She and Robert maintained a cordial relationship, united by their shared loss, even though they could no longer share their lives. The case file for Timothy Morrison grew thick over the years, filled with investigative reports, witness statements, tips from the public, and correspondence with other law enforcement agencies. Detective McKenna retired in 2005, passing the case to Detective Sarah Chen, a younger investigator with fresh eyes and new technology at her disposal. Chen digitized many of the old files and entered Timmy's information into updated missing persons databases that had better interagency communication capabilities. In 2010, DNA technology had advanced significantly since Timmy's disappearance. Detective Chen arranged for the Morrison family to provide updated DNA samples, which were entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, database. This would allow for automatic comparisons with unidentified remains found anywhere in the country. It was both a hopeful development and a sobering reminder that after more than 2 decades, the case might only be resolved through the discovery of Timmy's remains. The 25th anniversary of Timmy's disappearance in 2011 brought renewed media attention to the case. A local television station produced a half-hour documentary that aired during prime time, featuring interviews with Robert Morrison, Detective Chen, and several community members who remembered the search efforts. The program generated dozens of new tips, but once again, none led to concrete answers about what had happened to the boy. As the years continued to pass, Robert Morrison's health began to decline. He developed diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions that his doctor attributed partly to the chronic stress of his unresolved grief. Margaret would visit him occasionally, and they would sit in Timmy's room, looking through photo albums and sharing memories of their son's short life. These visits were both comforting and heartbreaking, serving as reminders of the family they had once been and the future that had been stolen from them. In 2018, 32 years after Timmy's disappearance, Detective Chen received a call that would reignite the investigation. A construction crew working on a renovation project at an old farmhouse about 60 miles south of Cedar Falls had discovered what appeared to be children's clothing buried in the basement. The items included a blue sweater with a cross embroidered on the chest, remarkably well preserved due to the cool, dry conditions of the burial site. The discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the Morrison family. Robert Morrison, now in his 70s and using a walker due to his declining mobility, was transported to the scene by Detective Chen. As he looked at the sweater through the evidence bag, tears streamed down his weathered face. It was unmistakably the sweater that his mother had knitted for Timmy, the one he had been wearing on the day he disappeared. However, the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Along with the sweater, investigators found other children's clothing that appeared to belong to different victims. Forensic analysis of the basement revealed evidence that multiple children had been held in the location over a period of several years. The farmhouse had been owned by a man named Charles Whitman, who had died in 1994 of a heart attack. Neighbors described him as a reclusive person who rarely interacted with the community and was often seen driving around in an old pickup truck. The revelation that Timmy might have been one of several victims was devastating to the Morrison family, but it also provided the first concrete evidence of what might have happened to their son. FBI teams excavated the entire basement and surrounding property, searching for remains and any other evidence that might help solve not just Timmy's case, but potentially several other missing children cases from the 1980s and early 1990s. Charles Whitman's background revealed a disturbing pattern. He had been arrested twice in the 1970s for approaching children inappropriately, but both cases had been dismissed on technicalities. He lived alone on the isolated farmhouse property, which provided ample privacy for criminal activities. Phone records from the time period showed that he had made numerous trips throughout Iowa and neighboring states, often coinciding with reports of missing children. Despite the significant breakthrough, investigators were still unable to locate Timmy's remains or determine his exact fate. The basement excavation revealed evidence of at least 4 different children who had been held in the location, but the lack of remains suggested that Whitman had disposed of the bodies elsewhere. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search the entire 40-acre property, but no burial sites were discovered. The case took an unexpected turn in early 2024, nearly 4 decades after Timmy's disappearance. Sister Catherine Martinez, a nun who worked at a Catholic charity in Chicago, was sorting through donations that had been collected for distribution to homeless shelters. The charity, St. Vincent's Outreach Center, regularly received boxes of clothing, household items, and personal belongings from community members throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. On a cold February morning, Sister Catherine was going through a particular donation box that had been dropped off anonymously the previous week. The box contained typical donation items, used clothing, some books, a few kitchen utensils. But at the bottom, she found something unusual. Wrapped in tissue paper was a photograph that immediately caught her attention. The photo showed a young man, probably in his early 20s, standing next to a Christmas tree. He had sandy brown hair and striking green eyes that seemed familiar to Sister Catherine, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen them before. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in blue ink, "Tommy, Christmas, 1995. Forever grateful for the family that saved me." Sister Catherine had been working with missing children cases for over 15 years through her charity work, and something about the photograph nagged at her. The young man's features reminded her of composite images she had seen of missing children, and the name Tommy could easily be a shortened version of Timothy. She decided to research missing children cases from the Chicago area and surrounding states. After hours of searching through online databases and missing persons websites, Sister Catherine found the entry for Timothy Morrison of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The age-progressed photographs showed a remarkable resemblance to the young man in the Christmas photo. Even more compelling was the timeline. If Timmy Morrison had been 8 years old in 1986, he would have been 17 in 1995, which matched the apparent age of the person in the photograph. Sister Catherine immediately contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department and spoke with Detective Chen. She emailed high-resolution scans of both sides of the photograph, and Detective Chen was struck by the physical similarities between the image and the age-progressed photos of Timmy Morrison. The handwriting on the back of the photo was analyzed, and experts determined that it had been written by someone with limited education, possibly someone who had learned to write as an older child or adult. The phrase, "the family that saved me," suggested that the person in the photograph had been rescued from a threatening situation and taken in by caring people. This aligned with the theory that Timmy had been abducted by Charles Whitman, but had somehow escaped or been rescued before serious harm could come to him. The fact that the photo was dated 1995, 1 year after Whitman's death, supported this possibility. Detective Chen shared the photograph with Robert Morrison, who was now 79 years old and living in an assisted living facility in Cedar Falls. Despite his age and declining health, Robert's eyes lit up when he saw the image. "Those are his eyes," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I would know my son's eyes anywhere, even after all these years." Margaret Morrison, now Margaret Peterson and living in Minneapolis with her husband David, was also contacted about the discovery. She flew to Cedar Falls immediately, and the reunion between the former spouses was emotional and hopeful. Both parents agreed that the young man in the photograph bore a strong resemblance to what they imagined their son might look like as an adult. The investigation into the photograph's origin became a priority for law enforcement agencies in both Iowa and Illinois. The donation box had been dropped off at St. Vincent's Outreach Center without any identifying information, but security cameras from nearby businesses were reviewed to see if they captured any useful footage. Unfortunately, the cameras only showed a figure in dark clothing dropping off the box during early morning hours when visibility was poor. FBI analysts enhanced the photograph using advanced imaging techniques, looking for any background details that might provide clues about where it was taken. The Christmas tree appeared to be in a modest living room, and partial views of furniture and decorations suggested a middle-class household. However, none of these details provided enough information to identify a specific location. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to have the photograph analyzed by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Iowa who specialized in facial recognition and age progression. Dr. Walsh had worked on several high-profile missing persons cases and had access to sophisticated software that could compare facial features across different ages. After extensive analysis, Dr. Walsh concluded that there was a high probability that the person in the Christmas photograph was indeed Timothy Morrison. The bone structure, eye spacing, and other distinctive features aligned closely with what the age progression models had predicted. While the analysis couldn't provide absolute certainty, it was compelling enough to warrant a full-scale investigation. The FBI reopened the Timothy Morrison case as an active investigation, assigning Agent Michael Torres, a specialist in long-term missing persons cases, to lead the effort. Agent Torres had successfully resolved several cold cases involving adults who had been missing since childhood, and he brought both experience and fresh perspective to the investigation. The key question now was identifying who had taken the photograph and who had donated it to the charity. Agent Torres theorized that someone who had known Tommy in 1995 had kept the photograph for nearly 30 years before deciding to anonymously provide it as a clue to help solve the case. This person might have recognized Timothy from age-progressed photos that had been circulated over the years, or they might have learned about his true identity through some other means. Working with Chicago police, investigators canvassed the neighborhoods around St. Vincent's Outreach Center, showing the photograph to long-term residents and asking if anyone recognized the young man. They also reached out to social service agencies, homeless shelters, and other organizations that might have encountered someone matching Timothy's description during the 1990s. The investigation expanded to include a review of all foster care placements, informal adoptions, and family arrangements in Illinois during the mid-1990s. While official adoption records were well documented, there were numerous cases of children being taken in by families through informal arrangements, particularly in cases where the children had been rescued from abusive situations. One promising lead came from Maria Gonzalez, a retired social worker who had spent her career helping children in crisis situations. She remembered working with several families in the Chicago area during the 1990s who had taken in children under unusual circumstances. One family, the Hendersons, had informally adopted a teenage boy around 1994 or 1995 who had claimed to have escaped from a kidnapper in Iowa. The Henderson family had moved to Arizona in the late 1990s, but investigators were able to track them down through public records. James and Linda Henderson, now in their 70s, initially seemed reluctant to discuss the boy they had taken in nearly 30 years earlier. However, when shown the Christmas photograph, Linda Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "That's our Tommy," she said quietly. "We knew he wasn't really our son, but we loved him like he was. He came to us so damaged, so scared. We just wanted to give him a safe place to heal." The Hendersons explained that in late 1994, they had found a teenage boy sleeping in their garage during a particularly cold winter night. The boy was malnourished, had clearly been abused, and was terrified of being returned to wherever he had come from. He told them his name was Tommy and that he had escaped from a man who had held him captive for several years. Rather than immediately contacting authorities, the Hendersons had made the controversial decision to take the boy in and help him recover from his trauma. They were aware that this was not the legal approach, but they were concerned that the child welfare system might not be equipped to handle his specific needs. Tommy had nightmares, panic attacks, and was extremely fearful of strangers, particularly men. Over the months that followed, Tommy gradually began to trust the Henderson family. He never provided details about his captivity, but he occasionally mentioned memories of Iowa and of parents who had loved him. The Hendersons suspected that he might be a missing child, but Tommy begged them not to contact police, saying that he was afraid his captor might find him again. As Tommy grew older and more stable, the Hendersons began to consider helping him reconnect with his original family. However, by that time, several years had passed, and Tommy had built a new life with them. He had started high school, made friends, and was beginning to plan for college. The decision of whether to reveal his identity became increasingly complex. The Christmas photograph from 1995 had been taken during what the Hendersons remembered as a particularly happy time. Tommy had been with them for about a year, and he was finally beginning to smile and laugh regularly. The note on the back of the photo had been written by Tommy himself, expressing his gratitude to the family that had given him a second chance at life. According to the Hendersons, Tommy had lived with them until he graduated from high school in 1997. He had then enlisted in the military, partly because he wanted to serve his country and partly because he still harbored fears about his past catching up with him. The military provided him with a new identity and a sense of purpose that helped him continue his healing process. The Hendersons had lost touch with Tommy after he completed his military service in the early 2000s. They knew he had settled somewhere on the West Coast and had started a family, but they had respected his desire for privacy and had not maintained regular contact. The last communication they had received from him was a brief letter in 2010, thanking them for their care and letting them know that he was doing well. However, Linda Henderson mentioned that she had received an unexpected phone call about 6 months earlier in late 2023. The caller had identified himself as Tommy and had asked if she remembered the Christmas photo from 1995. He had expressed concern that people might be looking for him and had asked if she still had any pictures from his time with their family. The Hendersons had given Tommy their word that they would protect his privacy, and they had initially been reluctant to share this information with investigators. However, the emotional reunion with Robert and Margaret Morrison, facilitated by Agent Torres, helped them understand the profound impact their decision had had on Timothy's biological parents. "We never meant to cause anyone pain," James Henderson explained to the Morrison family during a carefully arranged meeting. "We just saw a boy who needed help, and we did what we thought was right at the time. We always hoped that someday he would be ready to reconnect with his original family." The meeting between the two sets of parents was emotional and complex. Robert and Margaret Morrison were grateful that their son had found people who cared for him during his teenage years, but they also struggled with the knowledge that he had been alive and recovering while they spent decades not knowing if he was dead or alive. The Hendersons expressed deep regret about not contacting authorities sooner, but they maintained that they had acted out of love and concern for Tommy's well-being. Based on the information provided by the Hendersons, Agent Torres was able to begin tracing Timothy's adult life. Military records confirmed that a young man matching Timothy's description and using the name Thomas Henderson had enlisted in the Army in 1997 and had served with distinction for 4 years. After his discharge, he had used his military benefits to attend college and had eventually settled in Portland, Oregon. The trail led to Tommy Henderson, now 46 years old, who worked as a social worker specializing in helping children who had experienced trauma. He was married to a woman named Sarah, and they had 2 teenage children. The irony was not lost on investigators that Timothy Morrison had dedicated his adult life to helping children in situations similar to what he had experienced. Agent Torres made the difficult decision to approach Timothy directly rather than continuing to investigate him from a distance. The approach was carefully planned, with trauma specialists consulted to ensure that the contact would be made in the least disruptive way possible. On a quiet Saturday morning in March 2024, Agent Torres and a local Portland FBI agent knocked on Timothy's door. The man who answered the door was unmistakably the adult version of the 8-year-old boy who had disappeared from Cedar Falls in 1986. Despite nearly 4 decades of separation, his green eyes and facial features were still recognizable to those who had known Timothy Morrison as a child. When Agent Torres identified himself and mentioned the name Timothy Morrison, the man's face went pale, and he asked the agents to step inside. "I've been wondering when this day would come," Timothy said quietly as he sat down in his living room. "I've thought about my original family every day for 38 years, but I was never sure if it would be safe to reach out to them." Timothy explained that he had indeed been abducted by Charles Whitman on that October day in 1986. Whitman had approached him while he was playing in the Walsh family's backyard, claiming that his parents had sent him to pick Timothy up for a family emergency. As an 8-year-old who trusted adults, Timothy had followed Whitman to his truck without suspicion. The years that followed were ones that Timothy still struggled to discuss in detail. Whitman had held him captive at the farmhouse, along with other children who came and went over the years. Timothy had survived by being compliant and by trying to take care of the younger children who were brought to the farm. He had witnessed things that no child should ever see, and he had lived in constant fear for his life. In late 1994, when Timothy was 16, an opportunity for escape had presented itself. Whitman had suffered what appeared to be a minor heart attack and had been weakened for several days. Timothy had managed to break out of the basement room where he was being held and had fled into the winter night. He had walked for hours through snow and freezing temperatures until he had reached the Chicago suburbs, where the Henderson family had found him. Timothy's decision to keep his identity secret had been motivated by genuine fear that Whitman would track him down and kill him. Even after learning of Whitman's death in 1995, Timothy had been afraid that there might have been accomplices or that coming forward would put his adoptive family in danger. Over the years, as he had built a new life, the prospect of disrupting that life and potentially traumatizing his own children had kept him from reaching out to his biological parents. However, Timothy explained that he had never forgotten his original family. He had periodically searched for information about his case online, and he had seen his parents' appeals for information over the years. The decision to anonymously donate the Christmas photograph had been his way of providing closure for his family while still protecting his current life. "I wanted them to know that I had survived and that I was grateful for the love they had given me in those first 8 years," Timothy said, tears streaming down his face. "That love is what kept me alive during the darkest times." The reunion between Timothy and his biological parents was arranged carefully, with the assistance of trauma counselors and family therapists. Robert Morrison, despite his advanced age and poor health, was able to travel to Portland with the help of medical staff from his assisted living facility. Margaret Peterson flew in from Minneapolis, and the meeting took place in a neutral location with professional support available. The moment when Timothy Morrison saw his parents for the first time in 38 years was one of the most emotionally powerful reunions that Agent Torres had ever witnessed in his career. Despite the decades that had passed and the physical changes that time had brought to all of them, the fundamental connection between parent and child was still there. Robert Morrison, now using a wheelchair due to his declining mobility, reached out with shaking hands to touch his son's face. "I never stopped believing you were alive," he whispered. "I never gave up hope that I would see you again." Margaret Peterson was overcome with emotion, alternating between joy at seeing her son alive and grief for all the years they had lost. Timothy knelt beside his father's wheelchair and embraced both of his parents, finally allowing himself to feel the love and security that had been stolen from him so many years earlier. The reunion marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Morrison family, but it was also the start of a complex healing process. Timothy had spent nearly 4 decades building a life separate from his original identity, and integrating these two worlds required careful navigation. His wife Sarah and their children were supportive, but understandably shocked to learn about his true background. Timothy's story also provided closure for other families whose children had disappeared during the same time period. His testimony helped investigators understand the full scope of Charles Whitman's crimes and provided valuable information that assisted in solving other cold cases. While Timothy was one of the fortunate survivors, his experiences helped bring some measure of peace to families who had lost children to the same predator. The case of Timothy Morrison became a symbol of hope for families of missing children, demonstrating that even after decades of uncertainty, reunions are still possible. It also highlighted the complexity of child abduction cases and the long-term trauma that survivors carry with them throughout their lives. As this story comes to a close, Timothy Morrison continues to rebuild relationships with his biological family while maintaining the life he has created for himself in Portland. He has become an advocate for missing children and their families, using his unique perspective as both a survivor and a professional who works with traumatized children. The donation box that contained his photograph was never traced to its original source, but investigators believe that Timothy himself had arranged for it to be delivered to the charity. It was his way of finally bridging the gap between his past and present, providing the clue that would allow his story to be told and his family to find peace. Robert Morrison passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 months after being reunited with his son, finally able to rest, knowing that Timothy was safe and loved. Margaret Peterson continues to build a relationship with her son and has embraced her role as a grandmother to his children. The room that Robert had maintained exactly as Timmy had left it in 1986 has finally been transformed, no longer a shrine to a missing child, but a guest room where Timothy can stay when he visits Cedar Falls. The case serves as a reminder that behind every missing person is a family that never stops hoping, never stops searching, and never stops loving. For 38 years, the Morrison family lived with uncertainty, but their faith and perseverance were ultimately rewarded with the knowledge that love can survive even the darkest of circumstances.